So I would like to say first a few words about how I see migration in today's world, to then look into forced displacement in the context of the present international situation. First, we always had migration in the world. And in my opinion, migration is part of the world solutions. It's not a problem in itself. Second, it is not true that the essential migration in the world is moving from the developing world to the developed world. The biggest movement of people is a South-South movement, bigger than the South-North movement. And you only need to look at the relationship of Bangladesh and India to understand how massive are migration movements in the global South. And then it is absolutely essential also to recognize that looking at Europe, that has been in the focus of attentions in the recent past, fertility indexes in the majority of European countries are below 1.5, which means European societies are not sustainable without migration. And I always tell this story when I visit my mother, that is 93 years old, and we have, beyond the family support, we always have someone to take care of her with some minor healthcare capacity. When I visit her, I never seen a Portuguese taking care of her. It's always foreigners. And Portugal is a relatively poor country in the European context. If you go to Germany or to France or to Switzerland, you will never see a German, a French, or a Swiss taking care of elderly people. And aging societies badly need people to take care of elderly people, which means that migration is today in Europe absolutely necessary. And that the debate we are witnessing in Europe is to a large extent a schizophrenic debate about migration, and based on, I would say, concepts of false identity that, in my opinion, the Indian society has proven completely wrong. Diversity is a richness, not a threat. But for diversity to be a richness, societies need to invest and need to be able to invest in cohesion, in inclusion, creating the conditions for people to feel that they belong, to value the richness of diversity, and to be able to, like that, combat and defeat the forms of political populism, of xenophobia, of racism, of intolerance, and also of violent extremism that we are witnessing in today's world. Now, for these, I believe there are three things that would be very useful if states would be able to agree on those things. First, if migration is a need, if migration is a necessity, then it would be better to have it organized than to let smugglers and traffickers control this movement. Which means that we need much more opportunities of legal migration, and legal migration of different sorts. Migration will not stop. Migration will go on. Better make it in a regularized way, in an organized way, with cooperation of countries of origin, countries of destination, and make sure that smugglers and traffickers lose what is today one of the most profitable businesses in the world, that is favoring one of the worst groups of gangsters that exist at the global level. Second point I would like to make, it is very important that development policies, and development cooperation policies in particular, take into account human mobility. And if one looks at development cooperation policies worldwide today, they normally almost ignore human mobility. More, sometimes they contribute to uproot people. Now, if development cooperation policies would be aiming at creating the conditions for migration to become an option, not a need, that would considerably reduce the kind of pressure that we witness in some of the flows that take place in today's world, and would also create the conditions for people to have more choices in their own lives. The only country in Europe that has managed to have, I would say, some success in this kind of policy has been Spain, that had some development cooperation programs with Western Africa that allowed, for instance, to this irregular movement into the Canary Islands that you might remember in the past, boats sinking, coming to the Canary Islands, practically stopped because of the combination of some regular migration, some development cooperation aiming at creating opportunities in the areas of origin, and some cooperation between countries of origin and countries of destination. Recognizing the need of regular migration, recognizing the need of development cooperation policy to take into account human mobility. And then, third, cracking down very strongly on traffickers and smugglers, and creating the conditions for these criminal organizations to be effectively combated at global level are, I think, three elements in which international cooperation should be developed and would allow for migration to become what it is, an important contribution to global development, an important contribution to make the world work better. Unfortunately, our globalization is asymmetric. Money moves freely. Goods and services tend to move more or less freely, depending on trade arrangements and trade agreements, but people still face lots of obstacles to move. And this asymmetric globalization is one of the reasons why the global development is so unfair and why we witness enormous progress in the economy and the technology, but at the same time, enormous increase in inequality. Now, it is in this context of a debate on migration that is many times irrational and schizophrenic, of countries, I would say, being involved in discussions about false identities and fears. It is in this context that we are witnessing today more and more difficulties to grant protection to those in need of international protection, namely because they are fleeing conflicts. Now, unfortunately, we are seeing an enormous surge in the movement of people forced by conflict. Just to give you a few figures. In 2010, 11,000 people were displaced by conflict per day in the world. Many of them staying within the borders of their own countries. About 2/3 of them, they are internally displaced. 1/3 of them crossing borders, becoming refugees. 2010, 11,000 per day. 2011, 14,000 per day. 2012, 23,000 per day. 2013, 32,000 per day. 2014, 42,500 per day. I've not yet seen the statistics of 2015. I imagine they are also at these very, very high levels. Now, why is it so? Because we are witnessing a multiplication of new conflicts. At the time where old conflicts seem never to die, you've seen Afghanistan going on and on and on, Somalia going on and on and on, South Sudan now going on and on and on also again, but the Democratic Republic of Congo going on and on and on, and seeing conflicts more and more interconnected and more connected to problems of global security and, I would say, global terrorism. And this is creating a staggering acceleration of displacement that, of course, is in itself a drama because of the suffering of people caused by this displacement, but that it is also a symptom that we live in a world where the capacity of the international community to prevent conflicts and to solve conflicts has considerably diminished. When I studied in high school or in the university, and I remember some demonstrations in the streets, we lived in the bipolar world. And I remember, those times, there was the Vietnam War and things of the sort, and many things that I lived very strongly when I was a young man. When I was in government in Portugal in the 90s, we lived in a unipolar world. There was a hyperpower, one only hyperpower. Now, we no longer live in a unipolar world, not also in a bipolar world, but we are not yet in a multipolar world. We are in a kind of a chaotic world where power relations became relatively unclear. And with power relations relatively unclear, we see impunity and unpredictability multiplying everywhere. And we see people starting conflicts thinking that nothing will happen to them. International criminal justice is still in the beginnings and with lots of difficulties. And the capacity of the international community to act effectively has been considerably put into question. And some clumsy interventions, Iraq is a clear example, we can discuss the Libya situation, have always made it even more difficult for the international community to be able to stop conflicts in circumstances that are terrible from the humanitarian point of view and causing huge displacement in the populations affected by those conflicts. Now, in this context, where we are seeing this staggering escalation of displacement by conflict, we, at the same time, see more and more people being displaced by other causes. Sometimes they are called natural causes, but in effect, they are also man-made causes. And if you look at the combination of the global megatrends, population growth, climate change, but also urbanization, especially when this urbanization is chaotic and not employment-driven, food insecurity, water scarcity, all these global trends are interacting with each other. They are making the world smaller, and are making natural disasters more and more frequent, more and more violent, and with worse humanitarian consequences. And we're also seeing other areas of the world in which, for instance, deserts are progressing, drought is increasing. For instance, the Sahel, I remember when I was young, there was a drought every 10 years. Then there was a drought every 5 years. Now there is a drought every 2 years. Probably in a few years' time there will be drought permanently. And there are more and more areas where human life becomes impossible. Now, those that are displaced by conflict and cross a border are considered refugees, and at least they benefit from an internationally organized system of protection. But those that are displaced by this kind of natural disasters or slow onset of desertification, most of them stay within the borders of their own countries, but those that are forced to cross borders, they do not have any protection regime available to them. Now, there has been a discussion whether we should or not change the 51 Convention to include what some people call the refugees of climate or the refugees of hunger, and have a different regime for all these people displaced. I must say I am very worried when this is discussed, because I believe that if we tried today to redesign the 51 Convention, we would probably come with a worse one than the present one. As if we would try today to rewrite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we might come out with a worse Declaration of Human Rights. But having said so, I think that it is important to engage the international community to look into forms of humanitarian support, respect for human rights, and addressing the problem of solutions for these populations displaced by natural causes that have no solution within the borders of their own countries. A group of states, Norway, Switzerland, Mexico, and Costa Rica, launched a group called the Nansen Initiative. They have approved an agenda for protection that has been signed by a number of countries in the world. It is not a convention, it is not even soft law. It's a first approach of international cooperation in relation to displacement by natural causes, and I would very strongly encourage all member states to look seriously into that, because that is one of the gaps that we have today in our international protection regime. But what is serious for me is when you look at the increasing number of people displaced by conflict or by natural disasters, 80% by conflict. And when we see the protection conditions for these people, we need to recognize that things are getting considerably worse. During the 10 years in which I was High Commissioner, most borders in the world were open for refugees. During those 10 years, the international protection regime was relatively effective. I mean, there were many gaps, many difficulties, many problems, but basically, people in need of protection, fleeing a country in conflict or fleeing dramatic violations of human rights, would find a place where they could be protected. Now, unfortunately, in the last few months, we have witnessed a serious degradation of this condition. And it essentially started with the so-called European refugee crisis. And I would now lose some time in relation to this, that I think it's important to understand how the problem has developed. When, as High Commissioner, in September, I would go to the General Assembly of the United Nations when all the leaders are there, for 9 years, I tried to put the refugee issue in the agenda. And for 9 years, it was extremely difficult. I mean, there was a chance to speak here or there with 1 or 2 leaders, or to participate in one meeting in which a few people would be. But it was very difficult to put that in the agenda. All of a sudden, last year, in September, when I went to New York, everybody wanted to discuss refugees, and I was asked to go to all kinds of meetings in all sorts of formats to discuss the refugee situation. Was it because all of a sudden the number of refugees had increased dramatically? We are seeing that it has been increasing, but it is increasing steadily. No, it was for one simple reason. For the first time, a meaningful number of refugees came as a kind of a massive movement into the global north. And was this something gigantic and unmanageable? Well, we received in Europe last year a little bit more than 1 million people coming by boat. That means in a population of 500 million of the European Union, something of the order of magnitude of 2 per 1,000. In Lebanon, we have 1 refugee for each 3 Lebanese. So the question was not that there was, for the first time, a huge refugee movement. The question was that for the first time, the huge refugee movement came to the developed world. And so the global media all of a sudden discovered the problem of the refugees. And all of a sudden, refugees became an issue in all discussions everywhere. The Pope spoke about refugees. The President of the United States spoke about refugees. And I was invited as poor High Commissioner for Refugees to participate in all kinds of conferences and to deliver interventions in all kinds of situations. And the drama is that the situation was not properly managed. And as the situation was not properly managed, first, there was no prevention, not enough support to the refugees and to the host countries in the neighborhood of Syria, namely because it was essentially a Syrian-induced movement. Countries like Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey would need a much more solidarity and support to cope with the huge impact in their economies, in their societies, in their infrastructure, educational systems, health systems, and the international community gave them very little support, which of course created an enormous difficulty in those countries and in their capacity to support refugees. For instance, Syrians had about 90% of the Syrians in Lebanon and Jordan were below the poverty line, the national poverty lines, and only half was going to school. This demonstrates how difficult it is for a Syrian family that left Syria to think, I can live here. I mean, there were no conditions to live in a dignifying way because the countries could not afford to provide them with the minimum that was necessary, as this was overwhelming in relation to their dimension and their capacity. Much more support would be needed, and that support failed. And when the support also failed from the humanitarian point of view, and the international community announced that there will be a reduction in humanitarian aid to the refugees, the Syrian refugees, I remember the World Food Programme had to cut by 30% the food support to them. Obviously, this triggered this movement that started to cross more substantially the Eastern Mediterranean from Turkey to Greece. Now, not having been able to prevent these by effectively supporting the refugee communities and the host countries, Europe was also not prepared for this, which means there were no effective reception conditions and no effective distribution of this population by all European countries in an equitative way. So what we have seen was that movement that probably also here in televisions you have also seen, of people going through the Balkans from border to border in a chaotic movement that nobody controlled, and that gave also the impression to many European populations that there was an invasion, and that invasion was a threat to the identity or to the security or whatever of these countries. Now, the situation got worse and worse. Borders started to close. Refugee policy started to be more and more restrictive, and that had inevitably an impact southwards, which means that now the Turkish border with Syria is also, as you know, closed, and Syrians are in camps on the Syrian border. We have a very dramatic situation of Syrians outside Jordan, and we have had announcements, for instance, of the Kenya government in relation to the need to close refugee camps and send the Somalis back, which means that this, when especially in the global north, in the developed world, people start not to provide effective protection to refugees and start to reject refugees, this is a kind of impact that spreads like a virus and makes the refugee protection regime worldwide becoming much more difficult than what it was. In the last few months, I am worried to see a very serious deterioration of the refugee protection conditions available worldwide. And for Syrians, it is clear now they have not even a place to escape from the war in their own country. Now, what can we do? I would say that at global level, it would be absolutely essential, first, to increase the levels of prevention of conflicts and of prevention of other forms of forced displacement. And they are interlinked. Adaptation to climate change, if it is effective and well-funded and well done, will not only improve the living conditions of people and prepare them for the impacts of climate change, but will also reduce the competition for resources, which will allow for communities to live in a more peaceful way and to see less contradictions among them. So it is clear that prevention must be much more in the center of the international community's approach, and prevention in a comprehensive way. Prevention related to development, to reduction of inequalities, but also to human rights, also to the strengthening of institutions of states, prevention, finally, in relation to the origins of conflict, the reduction of tension, the creating the conditions for peoples to be able to live with each other and respect each other and avoid the kind of conflicts that are destroying large parts of the world. Second aspect that I believe is absolutely essential, to increase the levels of support to displaced populations and to countries hosting them. And this means a quantum leap. There was an important step forward. The World Bank finally has accepted to provide soft loans to refugee hosting countries, even if they are middle-income countries. This was a big change in global policies that is important to underline. But we need much more international support to the countries that are having a huge impact in their economies and in their societies, caused by huge inflows of people coming from outside their borders. And then it is for me evident that if you look at the Middle East today, as is probably you will also have to include in the Middle East Afghanistan, that, these things are all interconnected, and when you see people crossing, you see not only coming from Syria or Iraq, but also coming from Afghanistan in big numbers. I think it is clear that we would need a massive resettlement program similar to the one that we had with the boat people coming from Vietnam some decades ago. At that time, a number of countries united to receive millions of people that were displaced in very dramatic circumstances in a way in which solidarity was expressed collectively by the international community. I think that today we need this kind of approach again, instead of the kind of country by country attempts, and in which unfortunately we see that in every country, or at least in many of the countries, the refugee protection is becoming something very difficult to deliver, with public opinions themselves against that. And finally, adequate conditions of integration. I think that all societies in the world are today multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious. India is probably the best example of that. And that is a richness, not a threat. That is something that needs to be valued, not undermined. But that requires a huge political, social, economic investment, creating the conditions of inclusion, creating the conditions of social cohesion that make people feel that they belong, that make people value diversity, and create the conditions to defeat the expressions that we are witnessing today, more and more of political populism, xenophobia, intolerance, and then, on the other side, the violent extremism that easily generates or strengthens and enhances. I've said many times last year, when I was still High Commissioner, that when some European leaders said that they would not be able to receive Muslim refugees, that form of discrimination was the best way to support the propaganda of Daesh. It was the best argument Daesh could use to then justify the kind of absolutely intolerable actions that they have. We need to be able to understand the richness of diversity, and again, I don't think there is a better place than India for that to be proven. Thank you very much.